I analyzed 10 years of rookie fantasy data to find out what you should expect from this year's rookie running backs in fantasy football. I'll break down the data, then take you through my updated redraft running back rankings on the Fantasy First Down. There's a whole lot of random opinions on what to expect from this year's rookie running backs, but what does the data say? Today, we're going to go through and see what we should expect from running backs drafted in these ranges over the last few years. Before that, though, please make sure you like and subscribe on our YouTube channel if you don't mind. Plus, you can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can find all my rankings over there. And I also write my articles over at football.rasball.com. Let's get into it. So just to give you an understanding of what to expect here, I've basically looked through the last 10, technically 11 years of running backs who were drafted in the same positions, or at least in the same draft areas as this year's rookies. I looked firstly at when they first got over 15 touches to get an idea of when they kind of got into the starting role. I looked at if they had any major injuries that might have affected their fantasy finish. And then I looked at their fantasy finish by the end of the year and also looked at their fantasy finish after the breakout or before their injury, just to see if that was making a difference and see if we can expect some of these players to break out later on in the season. Jonathan Brooks was obviously the first one off the board this year. And he's in a slightly different situation to most in that we know he's probably not going to start until at least week 3 or 4 of the season. And that really affects our ability to correctly assess his value. I do think, though, that even if he was starting week 1, things look pretty darn ugly for guys drafted in this area. We've got some pretty good players in here, but most of them really struggled in their rookie seasons. We have to go really back to 2013, 2014 before we see guys like Eddie Lacy and Jeremy Hill, and they went into pretty good backfields in clear starting roles. Miles Sanders is probably the only other one that's even someone that you would have been happy having in fantasy that year. And Jonathan Brooks goes into a significantly worse offense than both of those players. He's coming in injured. It's going to take him a lot of time to get used to the NFL speed and standard. He's probably going to be in a committee with Chuba Hubbard for some time after he arrives. It wouldn't surprise me if he's not even the workhorse back or the every down back until the latter half of the season, the double-digit weeks. And that's real ugly for fantasy. We've even seen guys who've eventually broken out and taken over that lead role really still struggle later on in the season if they're drafted in this area. This is an awkward situation for Brooks. I don't like it. He's a major avoid for me in fantasy. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm avoiding all of the rookie running backs. Let's have a look at the guys drafted in the 3rd round. Obviously, Trey Benson went to the Cardinals, where he's currently sitting behind James Conner. Blake Corum obviously went to the Rams, where he's sitting behind Kyren Williams. And Marshall Lloyd went to the Packers, where he's sitting behind at least Josh Jacobs, and some have argued A.J. Dillon if you looked at my last preseason news video. But I would argue that he's clearly the running back 2 over there. So let's have a look at what we should expect from those guys. Now, obviously, Alvin Kamara and Kareem Hunt were a very different situation. You notice I've only had to go back to 2017 here because so many running backs are drafted in the 3rd round, but the pattern kind of continues. It's a lot of the same old, same old. If you go back a little bit further, there is more details in the article that I'm going to put out on Rasball in the next few days. So obviously, Alvin Kamara went into the Saints backfield where he was next to Mark Ingram, and they just ran the ball a heap. Because they were running the ball so much, he was able to be really effective. Plus, frankly, he was very good, even though it took him a few weeks to get going. On the other hand, of course, Kareem Hunt got fortunate with having an injury ahead of him, and that meant he was able to take over that every down starting role that I think we might actually see as Isaiah Pacheco in this year for the Chiefs. That's not what's happening here with any of these guys. These guys would all need a serious injury in front of them to have any chance of getting that sort of Kamara or Hunt workload. So can we expect something else? Well, Antonio Gibson didn't really go into that every down role until an injury happened as well. He needed an injury before he was able to be that guy. And Devon Achane, that was a weird situation as well. It wasn't so much there was an injury, he slowly kind of worked his way into the role, and then they just ran the ball a heap. He had some massive games in games where they were well ahead, and we're just able to give him a heap of the ball. The run game for the Dolphins last year was absolutely incredible. I don't think anyone expects either the Cardinals, the Rams, or the Packers to do anything similar to that this year. So what's the upside? For me, it's probably you're going to need an injury. And I think if James Conner goes down, we do see Trey Benson probably be an every down back. And we've seen with James Conner, that can be really valuable. That's RB2 numbers. Blake Corum, it's even better. I think if Kyron Williams goes down, suddenly you've got an RB1. I could imagine him having a top 5 finish if Williams goes down week 1 and he's able to play to the standard that we know he can. I think in that Rams offense, you kind of want that running back because they are going to use him as an every down back. So there is some value there, but they're mainly value as handcuffs. And I don't think you can be drafting them earlier than actual starters. I feel like they're coming out in, I don't know, round 8, 9, 10, that sort of region. And that's best case scenario. And that's not even for Marshall and Lloyd. For me, he has to go way later. I think that he's got far less upside because I think even if there's a Josh Jacobs injury, we probably see that Lloyd probably ends up sharing a little bit with A.J. Dillon, who I still don't think they've really fully given up on. So it's worth noting there's a lot of red in this table, and there's a good reason for that because people felt really good about Kendre Miller going into the season, and we know how that turned out. A lot of people were talking about Tank Bigsby, that maybe he was going to be the guy who takes some carries off Travis Etienne, and we saw that he wasn't even the number 2 over there. So there are no guarantees here. And in fact, I think probably it's far more likely that at least one, if not 2 of these guys bust totally. So you don't want to be relying on these guys in any form of fantasy football for output. This is a weak running back class. These guys probably got drafted earlier than they would have in many other classes as well. This is a sort of situation that you want to be avoiding until we get into that backup territory where there is plenty of upside, but only as backups. Now, the 4th round, well, this gets significantly uglier. And you can see here that very few players really managed to make it work. In fact, very few even got starting roles. And when they did, not many of them managed to hold on to it or do anything particularly productive with it. And if you look at the guys who got starting roles, where are they now? I mean, Dameon Pierce had a very big season, but he got a massive amount of carries. He got the 3rd most carries in the league, and he didn't do anything with it at all. He was very disappointing. Even after his breakout, still realistically, given how many touches he had, he should have been a lot better, and we should have seen that fade out happening. Michael Carter, I mean, he's a backup for the Jets now, and he was probably the next best. Chuba Hubbard's going to get some starting opportunities simply because of Jonathan Brooks' injuries. Go back to Naheem Hines. None of these guys is a Naheem Hines type, like receiving back. That's more Dylan Lowby, who was taken far later on. So I don't know. There's a lot of names here who kind of turned out to be okay afterwards, but didn't really do anything in particular. I think probably the biggest names that jump out there are Ramondre Stevenson, who's at least gotten a big contract. I think we expect Zamir White's probably going to be useful this year. Tony Pollard ended up being very good ultimately, but most of these guys ended up being very average running backs. Very few of them did anything of note at all over the course of their career, and certainly even fewer of them did anything much in their rookie season. So what can we make of this? Well, it's another one of those situations where I think you're looking at backups. Think about Ray Davis, for example. I think he could really take a lot of touches off James Cook because I think that James Cook isn't necessarily going to get the goal line stuff. That's not really his role. It's not the greatest receiving back, and Ray Davis can do both of those things. So I think he probably could be more of a guy who's annoying for James Cook owners than doing anything else, unless James Cook gets injured. And if we do see a James Cook injury, I could imagine that Ray Davis would suddenly be someone you really want to get for fantasy. I think that's probably also the case for someone like a Will Shipley potentially. If Saquon Barkley goes down, I think Shipley could potentially be very good. Jalen Wright, I'm not even sure that he falls into that category. I mean, they're going to use a committee in any situation. They're going to get Jeff Wilson involved, and they're going to want to have 3 running backs. He is probably more of the Raheem Mostert type, and that probably means he's more likely to slot into that goal line work if we do see Mostert go down. But even in that situation, you've got to imagine that Devon Achane is going to be the one that's getting the majority of the carries. So that's pretty ugly. I don't know that Bucky Irving's particularly a clear replacement for Rashad White. I think White is more of an every down back. I think Irving is a slightly better receiving back, and we see a little bit of Chase Edmonds still involved if that happens, but at least he's got a little bit of upside. And I think the one that I like best here of everyone, who's not even on the graphic here, unfortunately, is Braylon Allen, who's with the Jets. He's the clear backup to Breece Hall. All it takes is a Breece Hall injury, and suddenly you've got a guy who could potentially be a top 12 running back. I could definitely imagine that happening. So if I'm going to take anyone here, it's Braylon Allen or Ray Davis. Davis at least has some weekly usage upside. It is possible he'll carve out a role. I don't think that's going to happen with Allen. In best ball, I'd certainly take Davis before I took Allen. But in redraft, I think I'm probably leaning towards Braylon Allen. I do think there's a lot of upside there. Now, if you thought the 4th round was ugly, wait until we get to the 5th to the 7th rounds. Now, to be clear, this is not every running back drafted in the 5th to 7th rounds. There's about 70 of those. These are just the guys who got over 15 touches in any game in their rookie season. It didn't turn out well for many of them. Tyler Algier is probably the one that's probably stands out the most. Jalen Samuels was good for like 3 or 4 weeks at the end of the season, then did nothing. So I think it's probably the Falcon that's going to jump out to you. But realistically, I mean, he still wasn't fantastic. He was barely a top 24 back from week 6 onwards. Obviously, Isaiah Pacheco ended up being very good towards the latter part of his season. Sorry, I spelled his name wrongly there. Justin Jackson had a few good weeks at the end of his season. I think the name that really jumps out most is Chris Carson. He's the only one here who really turned into a star back. But it wasn't for very long, and ultimately he wasn't that effective in his rookie season. And obviously Pacheco is also going to end up being very good. Aaron Jones, of course, ended up being a big name, but he didn't do much in his rookie season. So there's some familiar names here, but we're talking about a big pool of players and very few of them turned into anything. So I don't know. If you're expecting Audric Estime to be the guy that comes into the Broncos room and turns everything around and goes ahead of Javonte Williams and goes ahead of Jaleel McLaughlin, I don't see that happening. I think he's going to have a role, but I think that role is probably just going to be very ugly and very inconsistent. I know a lot of people like Kamani Vidal, and they're like, oh, they've only got Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. They really like Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. They're the guys. Kamani Vidal is a special teamer at best. He's a 6th-round guy. We've seen how 6th-round guys go. Very few of them are particularly effective. Elijah Mitchell obviously had some good times at a couple of games, and Khalil Herbert was okay, and obviously Pacheco's a 7th-round guy, but there have been a lot of 6th and 7th-round running backs, and Vidal is going to fall through those cracks. If anything, the actual guy here probably will end up having more of a fantasy career than anyone else could be Dylan Laube. He's actually a very good receiving back, and I do feel like he'll have that role alongside Zamir White, who's not a very good receiving back. So for that reason, if I'm going to take anyone here, I mean, in a really deep league or a PPR league, it's probably Laube. I guess otherwise, Audric Estime is probably the best of the options, but it's a pretty ugly option. And if you're taking Kamani Vidal late in drafts, you are wasting your time. He is not going to be anything of value at all. You can drop him straight away, go get somebody else. Now let's have a look at how this affects my running back rankings. And this is obviously for redraft. And these are half PPR. The reason I do half PPR rankings is because that is what the Fantasy Pros competition is run on. It makes more sense to do half PPR that way. If you've got a PPR league, that's not going to affect these very much realistically. There are a couple of guys that move up and down, and I'll talk about how you can kind of do those adjustments and how I can help you out with PPR later on after we've gone through the rankings. For me, Christian McCaffrey is the clear number one. People are trying to get cute, trying to push Breece Hall up there. That's ridiculous. Christian McCaffrey was so much better than everyone else last year. That role hasn't changed, and we don't even know if Brandon Ayuk is going to be playing there next year. So you have to hold on to McCaffrey. He is the number one. I'm taking him first overall in pretty much every draft, unless maybe it's PPR with 3 wide receiver spots. Then maybe I think about CeeDee Lamb, but that situation's getting very ugly as well. I think you just got to take McCaffrey. He's so far and above everyone else. I've actually got Bijan Robinson second ahead of Breece Hall. A little bit concerned about how Braylon Allen comes in. I think he could have a role. I think we probably see that Bijan sees more of the ball this year, and Hall might see a little bit less, and they weren't that far apart last year. I do think this Atlanta offense is going to be excellent, and I do think you're going to want the running back here. So I've got Bijan ahead of Breece Hall. Most people will take Hall first. That's fine. They're not far apart for me at all. Then there's a big gap down to Jonathan Taylor, who I do think is still going to be good, but he's nowhere near those top three guys. But if he can stay healthy and this offense can function well with Anthony Richardson, that's good. I'm just concerned that Richardson's not going to check the ball down very much. He's more likely to scramble and run, so that's going to hurt Taylor's receiving upside a little bit. Saquon Barkley comes in at number 5, and I feel awkward about that compared to Jahmyr Gibbs, but in this Philly offense, we've seen the running back can be really effective, and they finally got a really good running back. I know DeAndre Swift was solid, but they weren't willing to use him properly, and I feel like they will use Saquon properly. So I'm feeling pretty positive about his situation. Gibbs is obviously going to be solid as well, but Montgomery's still there. He's not going anywhere. I think that I think that caps the upside a little bit, but only if Montgomery stays healthy. We see a Montgomery injury. Honestly, probably Gibbs goes into being the number 2 running back in fantasy football. Kyren Williams, I still feel pretty good about, but Blake Corum coming in has got to make you a little bit nervous. They're definitely going to take touches away from him. I think it's just a little bit more upside ahead of him. Travis Etienne, same idea. He was very good last year. He was the running back 2 last year, but I do think that that's not very sustainable the way he did it. I still think he's going to be a solid player. I certainly wouldn't be taking these other guys below him ahead of him, but I think he'll still be pretty good. Derrick Henry's a guy that's going to drop down a lot in PPR, but for me, I mean, that Baltimore running back situation is so productive if you're going to get the touches. I just don't know that he'll get the touches. I think Kid Mitchell comes in and gets enough just to mean that Henry's upside's a little bit capped. But I do think it's so easy to run in that game, and I feel like they're going to give him a lot of the ball, and that makes him a top 10 running back for me. Rashad White, I feel pretty good about. I think he's an every down back. I do think we see a little bit more of Bucky Irving than we potentially want to, but they don't really have many other weapons there. It's basically Evans, Godwin, and White, and a little bit of Kate Otten, and we might see a little bit of Jalen McMillan, but realistically, it's probably White is going to get a lot of touchdowns and a lot of touches in general, and I do like the upside there, and the receiving upside too. Isaiah Pacheco is a guy I'm very high on. I talked about him earlier. I feel like he's going to take over that Kareem Hunt role. We know how productive that can be. I really like him for fantasy football. Josh Jacobs going to a very good running room. We know how good it is to run for the Packers, and I do think that he's going to be very good there. He's an excellent running back. James Cook, I don't feel great about, but realistically, Buffalo is so good that I still think that with reasonable amount of touches, he's going to be able to rip off a lot of good games, but I am scared of what Ray Davis is going to do. Alvin Kamara makes me nervous, but I do feel like if he can get enough receiving work, he could be very productive. But I do think maybe they start to phase him out and bring Kendre Miller in. That's why he's not high for me, but he does at least have solid RB1 upside. Joe Mixon moving to Houston is interesting. I think that offense could be excellent. I just don't know exactly how they're going to use Mixon, but I feel like he could be super productive, so I do like his chances there. Ramondre Stevenson's the other way around. That's a bad offense, but I feel like he's the clear number 1 guy there. I know they've brought in Antonio Gibson, maybe as a bit of a backup receiving back, but I do think Stevenson's the guy you want to own. I feel like he has upside. You notice that Devon Achane is way lower than everyone else. I know most people have him in the top 10. That is insane to me. He's not the starting running back in Miami. Why would you put him in the top 10? He's going to be productive, but he totally lacks upside. He's not going to be the top guy most weeks. He's going to have some boom weeks. He's going to have some weeks where he gets like 8 touches and 40 yards. It's just going to happen. They can't keep running the ball like they did. They're going to bring in Wright and use Wright as well. Mostert's still the number 1 guy. He's the goal line guy. I don't understand what you're doing with Achane. I love him. I had him in college fantasy, and he was fantastic for me there. But realistically, he's not an every down back, and he never will be. The upside isn't there. We saw the same thing happen with Tony Pollard, where they're like, oh, he's going to get more touches. He's going to be fantastic. Firstly, I don't think he'll get more touches, and if he does, he's going to be a lot worse on every one of his touches. Now, Aaron Jones, on the other hand, I do think could be very good because we saw how fantastic he was for the Packers. We know that you can run with the Vikings, even though Alexander Mattison made it look really difficult last year. I do think Ty Chandler probably comes in and takes away enough touches that limits Jones's upside, though. Now, Kenneth Walker just has a habit of being the RB19, so he slides in there again. Charbonnet was actually playing more snaps than Walker last year at times towards the end of the year, which is totally nutty, but they're still giving Walker a heap of carries. I do think in half PPR, he has solid value. In PPR, he loses a little bit of value because I think Charbonnet probably becomes the true receiving back there. DeAndre Swift in Chicago, I'm just a little bit scared by what they're doing with Herbert and Johnson. I do think Swift is probably the main guy, and I think he has a lot of upside if they give him an actual proper amount of carries. But we've seen teams have been very wary to do that, whether he was in Detroit, whether he was in Philly. No team was willing to give him an actual amount of carries, and I feel like the same could occur here. James Conner is kind of moving up a lot of people's boards. I've loved James Conner for a long time, but I think the biggest issue here is you don't really want to take a player in fantasy. He's probably not going to be the starter by the end of the year. I do think there's a good chance that Trey Benson slowly takes over, especially once the Cardinals are out of the playoff race. I think that's probably when we start to see a lot more Benson. James Conner is fantastic. He's one of their best players for me, and I think they feel the same way. There have been reports suggesting that. But honestly, I mean, for fantasy, you're basically getting a guy who's going to be great early in the year and then give you nothing later on. That's not really the best way to play fantasy. David Montgomery, I think, could end up being underrated, especially if Jahmyr Gibbs gets injured. I think he probably has the most upside of anyone in this range. Having said that, Raheem Mostert, of course, was the RB3 last year, so it's hard to argue he doesn't have upside. He just needs to be the same as last year, and he's going to be a massive value. He's someone who's been moving up my rankings, and I think he could probably also move up higher, especially if it becomes clear that he is going to maintain the role from last year. Zamir White is someone that being overdrafted by a lot of people in half PPR and non-PPR. I can kind of see it, but he's not a receiving back. And they brought in a receiving back specifically to challenge Amir Abdullah because they want to have a receiving back. They know it's not Zamir White. He's going to be the first and second down back. That's going to be valuable for the Raiders, but not so valuable that you want to take him higher than this. I think Brian Robinson probably has a similar role. He is a solid receiving back, but they've also got Jalen Daniels. He doesn't really need to check down. He's got fantastic legs. So I feel like that Washington backfield scares me a little bit. Eckler looked a little bit washed, and so I have to believe that Robinson could end up ultimately taking over the whole role with Eckler just being a backup, but there's always the risk he isn't even the starter at all. Now, we know that Devin Singletary is near certainly the starter for the Giants. Don't get caught up in people saying it's going to be someone else. I like Tyrone Tracy mainly because my colleague Kiwi seems to love him and he gets those things right a surprising amount of the time. He was massive on Puka Nacua last year, for example. But he was also very large on Trey Sermon a couple of years ago, so take it with a grain of salt. Devin Singletary, I think, is going to be one of the lowest value starting running backs, but he is ultimately going to be a near every down running back. And even for the Giants, I think that still has value, especially if Daniel Jones decides to check down a little bit. Now, the Pittsburgh guys both go in there for me. I think Najee has a little bit more upside. I think if Najee goes down, Warren isn't really able to handle an every down role. Whereas I feel like we've seen that Najee can if Warren goes down. So that's why I have him a little bit higher. Not because I think that Najee will finish ahead of Jalen Warren, but because I think the upside's higher if certain things happen. Tony Pollard's obviously in there ahead of Tyjae Spears for the same reason, essentially. I feel like he can probably handle an every down role slightly better. And I also think there's more chance that he's going to be the clear starter ahead of Spears. Zach Moss in at 30. I feel uncomfortable about this. I feel like Chase Brown could have a real role here, but I think it is also possible that Zach Moss is just the starter and that Chase Brown is more of a change of pace back and maybe a receiving back. And if that happens, then Moss would be the guy that you definitely want to own. And that's why I've put him here ahead of a few other guys who I just don't think they have that upside. Obviously, there's Spears, I mentioned earlier. Austin Eckler, I don't think it's impossible that he's the starter there. I just think it's a very ugly situation. It is possible that Daniels just decides he's going to check down a heap instead of getting himself injured. But I don't feel very comfortable with that. I feel like Eckler is someone who will probably drift down my rankings. Having said that, if there's a Brian Robinson injury, all of a sudden I feel like Eckler could be quite valuable, although I do think we still see a little bit of Chris Rodriguez. The whole Cleveland situation is ugly. A lot of people really like Jerome Ford, but Nick Chubb's still there, and there's been a lot of positive stuff about Nick Chubb's recovery. I just can't imagine that Nick Chubb's going to be the old Nick Chubb. And even if he is, I feel like there's going to be some sort of committee situation here. I think both of these guys are going to have limited value. I think they're going to do something, but what they're going to do, I absolutely don't know. Jonathan Brooks, this is about as high as I can get him. I don't feel great about this situation with Brooks. It's not fantastic, but you're at least talking about a guy who may be a starter down the track. And I feel like that's kind of the opposite of the James Conner situation. In fact, realistically, James Conner and Jonathan Brooks, probably two guys that you can kind of push together nicely. I think it makes more sense to put Conner with Benson, but it is possible that Conner and Benson end up in a committee, and therefore you kind of want a guy who's going to be strong down the stretch, and that would be Brooks. Gus Edwards is probably the starter for the Chargers, but it's hard to know exactly what's going on there and how much value he has. I think he probably ends up as high than the running back 35, but I think it's hard to imagine him being a top 20 running back, for example, and that lack of upside is the reason I don't have him higher. Chase Brown, I don't think he's going to be the clear starter there, but I think he is probably one of the highest value backups, and I think that probably could end up being a committee. So if you're going zero RB, I feel like Brown's a good person for you to pick up because he will probably get you some points. Ezekiel Elliott is another that's good for 0 RB. I think he's clearly got a role. He's clearly the best blocking back there, and I think he's a good receiving back. I don't know how it's going to work with him and Dowdle, and we're now hearing about Royce Freeman, but it does seem like Zeke's the clear starter. I don't understand why. That makes no sense to me at all. I think it's very possible that halfway through the season, we see that Dowdle's the clear number one guy there. But I think it could be pretty ugly early on. And I think Zeke's the guy you want out of the gate, especially if you're going 0 RB. Blake Corum, obviously my favorite backup. I talked about him earlier. I also talked about Chuba Hubbard. I think he's going to be good the first couple of weeks, and that would make him very valuable if you're going 0 RB. Javonte Williams, I think, is probably going to win out in that backfield. Obviously, Cecil Lammy was talking about Jaleel McLaughlin, how he thinks he might be the starter. I mean, that's not the buzz we're hearing. I mean, Lammy's very good, and he does tend to be very accurate, but I do think that ultimately Javonte Williams probably wins out in this situation. I think that Ty Chandler is a little bit underrated. It wouldn't surprise me if this ends up being a committee, and I feel like he's definitely the guy that if there's an injury ahead of him, and Aaron Jones always gets injured, he's going to be the guy that is going to win out the most. He's explosive, and I feel like he's in a good situation there. Trey Benson is another guy that I think is going to be a valuable backup if we see a Connor injury, and Connor always gets injured, that you'll probably want Benson, even though there's talk that they really like other guys like Michael Carter, etc. Now, I talked about Rico Dowdle earlier. He's fallen a lot for me. I had him a lot higher previously, but I'm starting to feel like it is going to be Zeke initially and that Dowdle's going to have to win that role, and even then it might not be a role worth having. Having said that, I mean, the Cowboys are a playoff team. They know how to score points, so you do kind of want their running back, so it's worth taking shots on these guys just to see what happens. It's hard to feel this good about Jalen Wright. I feel like he's probably another 0 RB guy who's going to get some points each week, but realistically, his upside's a little bit capped. Ray Davis is the other way around, where I feel like he could get you some points each week, but his upside's huge. All he needs is an injury ahead of him, and all of a sudden he's going to be very valuable. And I kind of want the running back for Buffalo. I feel like that offense is very good, and he's a guy you want. Braylon Allen's in that very similar category. He's a very valuable backup to Breece Hall. He's someone I'm taking a lot late in drafts. I'll have Allen and Davis in a heap of teams, and I don't want an injury to James Cook or Breece Hall, but my fantasy teams will win a lot of games if we get one. J.K. Dobbins obviously sits in behind Gus Edwards at the moment, but I think it's possible he takes over that starting job at some stage during the year. He is very good. Tyler Algier is another guy who's just a very high-ranked backup guy. We've seen injury to Bijan Robinson. I think you probably want the running back in Atlanta. And finally, Zach Charbonnet. We saw that he didn't do great when given the opportunities for the starting role when Kenneth Walker was injured, but I think he is probably the clear backup, and he's going to get a lot of snaps, not a lot of touches, but a lot of snaps each week. I feel like that's kind of showing you how they value him, and ultimately he will get opportunities if we see an injury. Now, the question is, when do you draft these guys in drafts? Well, it's going to depend on your league. It's going to depend on how many running backs you start. It's going to depend on your scoring setting. It's going to depend on how many people are in your league. It's going to depend on where you're drafting in the draft order. There's so much to think about, and no amount of online rankings and online reading is going to answer that question for you. Luckily, I can personalize rankings specifically for your league for a very low price. So email me at benwasley23@gmail.com if you're interested in taking me up on this very exciting offer that a lot of people actually took me up on last year, and it seemed to go really well for them. So I'm hoping I can help you out as well. And that's all we've got for today. Thank you for joining me on the Fantasy First Down. If you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe. I'll be coming out with more preseason news after the weekend's games in the next 3 or 4 days. Plus, you can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and my articles are out on football.rasball.com. I'm going through a lot of this rookie QB and running back ranking stuff in a little bit more detail. So I hope that you'll check that out as well. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.